Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to House Finance. Today is our third and final joint session with the House and the Senate Fiscal Committee. And today we have members of the House and the Senate fiscal staff, Sharon Reynolds-Ferlin and Peter Marino, who will be presenting to us today a review of the Pension Advisory Group discussions that have taken place in the last several months. So I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned, today's purpose of the presentation is to give you an overview of the discussions of the Pension Advisory Group, give you an idea of the things that were on their agenda, some of the things that they looked at, so that you have a feel for the kind of issues that they were trying to address. And one of the things you should note is they are working on a summary of their work, so we expect to see that shortly in terms of some of the information that they may provide to you down the road. But we thought it would be helpful to give you a flavor for what they were looking at, so that as you go forward, you have a baseline for what other people were discussing as you were dealing with this issue. As you may be aware, the advisory group, which was recently created by both the treasurer and the governor, was made up of about a dozen folks representing labor, business, and a number of other folks, a few municipality issues. Both Sharon and I, as fiscal advisors, served as liaisons only. We did not serve on the actual advisory group, but we're more like observers, and we raised questions if we saw something that needed some clarification. But the group worked diligently over the last couple of months. They had a number of meetings that we'll talk about. But one of the key purposes of the group was not necessarily to make specific recommendations to the governor and the treasurer, but to use it as a sounding board and to go through things and to discuss issues so that the breadth of the issue that they were dealing with was better understood. They did hold 4 public meetings in different locations across the state from June through September. The last meeting was September 12th. They did offer an opportunity for public input, but it wasn't at the hearings. They created a website, and that was designed to gather comments from the public through that means. The advisory group was brought up to speed on some of the comments that were brought forward in the website at a couple of the meetings, but there weren't any public testimony permitted at the meetings. In between the 4 meetings, members of the advisory group were assigned tasks to do additional research and to work on issues so that they could bring that information back to the advisory group at subsequent meetings. One of the first things they started at, and which you're already familiar with because we've discussed it in previous hearings, was what is the funding status of the pension systems? And so they did a baseline education effort for all of the advisory groups, so they had the same information in front of them. And as you know, the funded status that we've talked about was a result of a number of things, such as the contribution levels, both at the state as well as local communities, the benefit policies and the benefit growth over time, the returns on the investments that were in the different pension systems, and most recently the experience studies, which affected all of those different systems differently. This table should look familiar to you. This table shows you what the estimated funded ratio is for the state's pension systems. As you can see, the state employees and teachers have declined from about 62% in 2011 to about 48% in 2013. One of the issues when people review funding ratios is, what does it really tell you? And one of the things that was discussed in the advisory group and has been part of discussions in pensions over the long term were the what is 80%? You hear that often. 80% is kind of a threshold that people are trying to reach. And a lot of different perspectives have come to the conclusion that that represents a basically healthy pension system. One of the things that you should recognize when you look at this trend line is that particularly in the last year, fiscal 13, that decline in the funded ratio represents a significant change due to the assumption changes. And we discussed that at length in the first meeting that we had here 2 weeks ago. One of the things that the committee also discussed at great length was what was the potential impact of inaction. Should you ignore the issue of pension issues, what might be happening? And one was, it was clear that people were talking about the lack of retirement security for public employees. Should assets no longer be available to pay out the benefits promised, that certainly puts people at risk. Secondly, there's significant budget pressures, particularly when we've been discussing the fiscal 13 budget and those change in assumptions, what has happened with the employer contribution that's necessary to meet your obligations. And the concern there is as that continues to grow, it'll put undue pressure on the budget for other things that you know are priorities and you want to make investments in. In addition, the potential impact is what burden it will have on active state employees. As if you recall, there is now basically a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of actives versus retirees. That puts considerable pressure on the pension system's assets. And lastly, and we talked about this a little bit more on the municipal side last time, but it certainly has state implications, are what impact it might have on the cost of borrowing in the future. The advisory group focused on the major principles that it was interested in making sure that it was looking towards in terms of discussing the different policy options that might be available. And 3 seemed to emerge consistently throughout the group's discussions. One was certainly retirement security, something that will be reliable and sustainable over time. The second was making sure that it was affordable to taxpayers. Striking that balance is going to be difficult, obviously, but it's something that does not put undue pressure on the budget. As I mentioned, as you're well aware, working in both finance committees, that there are a lot of priorities and competing interests for very limited resources. And third was a long-term solution. Given the issues that you're dealing with, they wanted to have something that would put you on a path for success. So you did not have to revisit this on a regular basis. You wanted to find a solution, put you on the right path, and move forward. One of the areas that received considerable discussion amongst the advisory group was what defines a secure retirement. And the discussion talked greatly about what is the income replacement rate. And I wouldn't say everybody agreed to exactly the range, but it seemed to fall somewhere in the range of people said income replacement is somewhere in the range of 65 to 80%. Certainly depends on where you sit in terms of your perspective and what that range would look like, but that seemed to be where they fell. The other issue is how to get to that range. Is that what combination of resources, what kind of sources would you bring to the table to achieve that goal? And the sources range, obviously, from pension benefits, Social Security, which most employees do participate in, but there are significant numbers that do not, and other savings, such as your individual savings that you may be planning on using for retirement. In this discussion, they relied on a number of national studies as well as talking and surveying amongst each other. We provided some information that the advisory group had in terms of what the average recommended replacement rates were for about 5 different studies nationally, and it ranged from about 70 to almost 80% amongst those studies. And within those studies, they had ranges as well, but that gives you a picture that seems to land right in that area where the advisory group was discussing. To give you a flavor for what that means for at least the Rhode Island state employee pensions and teachers, is you can see on this chart the years of service and what percentage of your income would be so-called there available to you through retirement. And for example, Schedule A with 10 years of service, 17% of your income would be replaced if you retired with 10 years of service versus 16 for Schedule B. And as you go out, at 35 years for a Schedule A would be able to maximize their retirement at 80%. And Schedule B, if you recall when we talked about that 2 weeks ago, it would be closer to 68%. So it gives you a flavor for what the current defined benefit program is provided through the state employees and teachers. One of the issues that got considerable discussion was the issue of Social Security. And Social Security can replace 30% or more of one's income for retirees. However, nearly half the teachers across the state don't participate in Social Security. That's almost 7,000 out of the 14,000 and change teachers in the state. Many public safety employees as well do not participate in Social Security. So this really raised the fundamental question: if you're shooting for a income replacement target of somewhere between 65 and 80%, how would Social Security play in or not play in that calculation for a large number of individuals across the state, particularly teachers? I wouldn't say that the advisory group came to any kind of conclusions, but it certainly was an area that was discussed amongst the members. The advisory group also talked a great deal about what are the different plan design concepts. What are the things that they may or may not be able to affect as they discussed what pension reform could or couldn't look like. They looked at benefit provisions, such as what constitutes eligibility, what changes may or may not be available. what the accrual rates may be. We just saw earlier the Schedule A versus the Schedule B table, and those differences in accrual rates has an impact on your costs. The earning period in which you are calculating, as well as the COLA, which obviously got a number of interesting discussions. They also talked about cost sharing, not just the employer's share, but also the employee's share. The discussion of what is that sweet spot, what is the right combination of employee and employer contributions. There was also discussion about tiering. Is there a way to address this, perhaps dealing with different groups of individuals in terms of new hires? Can you structure something that affects only new hires? Can you structure something that affects different classes of employees? And lastly, they did discuss, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, the concept of self-correcting mechanisms. And that was put in light of one of the principles we discussed earlier about not having to return and having something that's a long-term solution that you don't have to come back and try to fix again. So the self-correcting mechanism concept was discussed as well. In doing their due diligence, they did task several members as well as some volunteer staff to look at, are there any alternative funding mechanisms that can help us get to the point where we can get to 80% funded or some other target level? They reviewed current state assets to see if there were opportunities to sell or to lease or other ways to monetize those resources. They also analyzed the potential or explored the idea of pension obligation bonds, and they also reviewed what the impact reamortization would do in terms of different structures that they were put before them. As they reviewed all these things, there were different findings. There were limited opportunities that they identified when it comes to state assets. They did discuss pension obligation bonds and the experience in other states. And there certainly was discussion about reamortization and how that might relate to a pension reform package. They did discuss three forms, essentially, of what we would describe as types of pension plans as part of the process. They discussed a defined benefit plan, the defined contribution plan, and perhaps some kind of hybrid design that kind of takes the best of the two and see if it can work. As we've discussed in the past, the defined benefit plan, which is something that we are all familiar with in the state, it provides a guaranteed, predictable benefit that essentially takes into account compensation, years of service, and age. And once you've met the eligibility requirements, you have a guaranteed pension going forward. Now, defined benefit plans, as was discussed at the advisory group, have advantages and disadvantages. So-called advantages would include a predictable benefit for employees. There's limited risk to the employee. The risk is on the employer. They're fairly efficient to operate and administer. They tend to be low cost in terms of administering the programs. And as you'll see on this slide, it does encourage longer-term employment. People invest in the system. They want to be here. They want to make sure that they earn the benefit, but it also allows you to take advantage of the institutional knowledge that they bring to the table. On the flip side, there are some disadvantages to defined benefit plans. Certainly, the financial risk is on the employer, which also equates to the taxpayer. The employer cost can vary and can increase depending on what's happening with your assumptions and what's happening with your demographics. It certainly lacks certain elements of flexibility. You have limited choices what you can and can't do. And as I mentioned, encourages long-term employment, which can also serve as a disadvantage if you need employees to turn over for having fresh blood, change environment. There can be also a potential disadvantage as well. The defined contribution plan was also discussed at length. And as you know, these plans are designed where contributions are made to an individual retirement account. And the retirement benefit is not predetermined like a defined benefit program. And it's entirely dependent on the account balances when you're finished with your retirement. The account balance is based on the money that you've contributed, either through the employee or the employer. It also is a reflection of whether or not you've had investment gains or losses over a period of time. These defined contribution plans, also often referred to as DC plans, also have benefits or pros and cons, so to speak. Pros, clearly individuals have a sense of control over their destiny, so to speak. They can make their own choices how to allocate their resources, and they can determine the degree of risk they're willing to take with those resources. By definition, they're fully funded, and that means that you're not guaranteeing a lifetime benefit, but they're fully funded as the moment that the dollars are in there, and they accumulate over time, hopefully. It also permits employee mobility. Defined contribution plans permit you to take those resources with you as if you change employment. The downsides or the cons of defined contribution plans include the past has indicated, and we've heard this from a number of testimonies, that participation rates can be low, particularly if it's voluntary. People find it very difficult to make savings judgments in terms of what they want to put away. Individuals tend not to invest or plan well. It takes a lot of effort to design a pension plan or a savings plan that will make sure that you have something in your years later. And last, the risk is on the employee. They certainly bear the burden of whether or not those returns are positive or negative in terms of the long run. One of the other pieces of discussion was, well, there have been hybrid plans that have been out there and discussed, and hybrid plans are designed pretty much to take advantage of the positive sides of both of those and minimize the weaknesses of both DB and DC plans. And this slide is just to give you an example of if you were trying to achieve 80%, this is what the advisory group kind of talked about as what might a hybrid plan look like to achieve that 65 to 80% target that they discussed. And it had a combination of things. It had a defined benefit plan that would provide some baseline of resources when you retire. It would include a defined contribution plan that would be able to use employee and perhaps employer contributions to build those resources, and Social Security. And as I mentioned earlier, Social Security was certainly a discussion because half the teachers and some public safety employees do not participate in that. The concept, at least the concept that was put before the advisory group, was that this was trying to build, on top of taking advantage of the strengths of the two different systems, but also try to build a sense of risk sharing in terms of the overall pension program. With that, I'm going to pass it to my good friend Sharon to talk a little bit about some of the scenarios that the advisory group was exposed to as they discussed these different concepts. And I'll leave that with Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Chairman, members of the committee. As Pete mentioned, the group was taken through all of those concepts, and then it was up to the actuary to sort of put those into motion and put some of those concepts around the numbers we have and talk about what a changed plan might look like. One of the important things that the actuary did is, and you all probably saw it in the briefing that the treasurer and the actuary gave to you at your individual chambers, and that is to what they call separate the issues. You have your current retirees and those who are eligible to retire, who they've sort of separated into a group that they would consider impacting one way. And then there's the current active employees not eligible to retire, and then of course future employees in that same group. So what they did is, and you'll see the next few slides relate only to state employees, and that's just for simplicity in illustration. The concepts would be applicable across the different systems similarly. And great pains were taken throughout to call it possible framework, possible scenario. So these were not necessarily recommendations, but they were just examples of what something might look like. So if you look at this slide here, it shows you what I'm talking about when I say separating the issues. So of the total, now again, just state employees, $2.7 billion unfunded liability, the actuary first separated and apportioned that to current retirees and those who are currently eligible, and a portion to the current active employees. And then similarly split the funded ratio. And the idea here is that they would present things that would impact one group one way and the other group the other way. And you'd see this slide here talks only about current retirees, and it was fairly clear from the presentations that the consideration was given to really just things to do with the COLA as far as the current retirees and those eligible to retire. So what this slide shows you is what the current, again, the current